All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, a mission of this show is to highlight the plight of struggling working Americans and to lift up their voices and the voices of those who deign to respect them by advocating for their interests with public policy. And while the plight for working Americans and families has been desperate now for decades, one particular generation of people has it particularly bad. That is the millennial generation, no matter their race, creed, or gender. Yesterday, the New York Times profiled a millennial couple. The man had two jobs, one at a carpet store, the other at a coffee shop. His girlfriend worked at a coffee shop as well. They lost all jobs in a span of just a few weeks. They only have $1,000 to their name, which is just enough to cover their $800 rent check for this month. They won't be paying their student loans, and they've foregone the health care that they wanted to purchase. Their story is a common one of many in the millennial generation, both for those who entered college and working class Americans who thought that their stable, blue-collar jobs would be there for them to support a family and a robust life in a non-urban center. That future, of course, vanished in 2008. As Annie Lowrey actually explained in a very prescient piece last August in The Atlantic, noting that millennials graduated into the worst job market in over 80 years, meaning a full decade of lost wages for an entire generation. Lowrey said that the 2014 data reveals both millennial men and women in 2014 were making less than their baby boomer counterparts at the same age, despite the economy being orders of magnitude richer and larger. And by nearly every measure, they are worse off. Student debt at explosive levels, less wealth, stagnant wages, higher costs of living, less children, less savings, less assets, and more. The millennial generation's economic conditions was the logical outcome of a society and an economy that prioritized consumerism and neoliberalism to their furthest ends. And Lowrey actually predicted all of this, writing, quote, "A downturn that leads to higher unemployment and lower wages will force millennials to wait even longer to start accumulating wealth, making it far harder for them to accumulate any wealth at all." So now here we are, where not only this generation is reaping the horrific rewards of the economy, but a new generation enters it in similar straits. As I covered here almost 3 weeks ago now, Generation Z is now graduating from college, or those who are in the working class have been furloughed, serve at the whims of the professional class at the worst time. The small business payroll loans will help, but were younger Americans really making all that much in the first place? So much of the Washington discussion right now is about getting folks back to work, and nobody is more in favor of that than me. But in this transformational moment, when anything is possible, and when we understand once and for all that in a time of immense crisis like this one, only the government can step in and actually do something about the immense problems that we face, it's time to recognize that the kids are not all right, and they haven't been for quite some time, because they're not even kids anymore. I return again to a recent Annie Lowrey column written about 2 months ago, before things really went off the rails, writing, quote, "In one of the best decades in the American economy has ever recorded, families were bled dry by landlords, hospital administrators, university bursars, and child care centers. For millions, a roaring economy felt precarious or downright terrible. With 40% of Americans struggling to come up with $400 in a crisis, how 20% in normal times couldn't pay their bills, and 1/3 of households were classified as financially fragile. All of this pain is felt doubly so for younger Americans, especially those who are not college educated. And as we look forward to paying their lost wages, we might ask whether they were high enough in the first place, and what can be done so that the bottom does not fall out again, and how exactly we can live in a country where people can actually just get a job and prosper again." And something, in slower news days, I like to take a picture at the bigger picture. And I was reading this.
Crazy that this counts as a slower news day, by the way.
I was taking and reading this profile of the Times, and that struck me because these are two college-educated Americans who are working at a carpet shop and two coffee shops. So first of all, the dream of college didn't work out.
I bet we have a lot of people watching right now who relate to that greatly.
Can't imagine, how, and there's millions of people who fall into that boat. So then or maybe they didn't. Maybe one of the large percentage of people who start college and decide it's not for them, that's fine, but then are saddled with student debt and have struggle paying it.
Yep.
And I'm reading this and I'm saying, these people lost everything they had within a span of weeks. Only $1,000 to their name, $800 rent check is coming, $200 in the bank for food, for student debt payments. Neither of them have health care. They had both been saving up, aspiring to be able to purchase health care after one of these exchanges that Joe Biden wants to open. And I'm just thinking about the hopelessness of being in that type of situation, and what has the response been? it's been a $1,200 rent check payment that might come in a week, maybe two. Nobody really knows. Maybe these people didn't have direct deposit information with the IRS, which means nothing's coming until August. Sure, they can file for unemployment, which makes up some lost wages. But again, I'm just looking at this and I'm saying their wages have been so stagnant, so low for so long. And then relative to that, there's no wealth to fall back on. All of their money just goes to it flows upward to the financial elite and to the baby boomer generation, the landlord class. And I'm just thinking, wow, like again and again and again, this entire crisis just reveals how much of a kind of a husk the economy is, particularly for people who are down at the bottom. And I'm just thinking about so many millions of younger Americans. Like I said, I mean, more than half the country doesn't go to college.
Right.
I mean, for so many of those people.
2/3 of millennials don't go to college.
Right. And so for those people in service sector jobs who are working class, urban working class, rural working class, I mean, their jobs are just gone. I mean, gone and with no support whatsoever. And already we're living in pretty dire straits.
Right.
Had no savings, had no wealth. And it's those who are hit the hardest at a time like this. And yet, their voices are not heard here in D.C.
No, in fact, and this is one of the things I've been trying to warn about within the Democratic Party is who did young people overwhelmingly vote for? Like 60-70% voted for Bernie Sanders. And what happened? The Democratic Party went all in to say no. To say no to your values, no to your ideas, no to the candidate that you back. We will do everything we possibly can. I think it was Stoller who tweeted, probably. It sounds like a Stoller tweet, basically. The Democrats got more organized to defeat Bernie Sanders than he's ever seen them get organized to defeat any Republican in our lifetime.
Right.
And it's totally true. And that is a generational battle right there. It's also a class battle. Those two things are interrelated. And so what do we hear right now in this time of crisis? Those who were doing well in the status quo, who benefited from the status quo, who tend to be of older generations that did much better than millennials, and millennials are doing much better than Gen Z is going to be in a position to do. Those older people say, let's just deal with the crisis. We can't afford to think about all this restructuring. That's nice, that's cute. We'll deal with that later.
We hear you.
Right, we hear you. But we got to let's just get the ventilators out. That's what we got to focus on like a laser right now and get that $1,200 payment out. And then later on, we'll deal with that whole restructuring thing that you all have been talking about. Later on, never comes. The only big changes that even ever happen in American politics now, given how sort of broken down and defunct our system is here, the only changes come by crisis. That is the only time. And that's true somewhat throughout history, but especially now, the only time when you can change the trajectory just a little bit happens in a crisis, which is why you and I think we're so exercised about this massive corporate bailout, because it has exactly the opposite effect of what you want to see. What we want to see is communities being revitalized where small business can flourish. Individual people and families and communities can flourish. Instead, what we're going to see coming out of this by design, by a bipartisan consensus in this town to favor the status quo, and by its nature to favor the older generations who have benefited from that status quo, what we're going to see is continued consolidation. The big guys getting bigger. All of the wealth and human capital and resources continuing to be sucked out of small towns and small cities in America and consolidated among a few places and a few individuals. The way that they have responded to this crisis will only exacerbate those trends, and it will fall hardest on the youngest people.
Exactly, because they have nothing to fall back on and they have nothing to work towards. And that's a very hopeless situation to leave millions and millions of people in. And that, again, I can't overstate, and I try to, in order to communicate with older people and older generations, because they're like, why is there such like a hopelessness amongst the millennials? And I'm gonna think about it. We came into age, you graduate from college or from high school or whatever, into the worst economic crisis, the worst labor market over 80 years. Your childhood is decades of foreign wars in which America is losing unequivocally. Thousands dead, thousands of Americans dead, millions of Iraqis, Afghan civilians, so many others. And you look at this and you're like, what am I supposed to be hopeful about? Like there was nothing great that really happened within those generations, just kind of a meandering, all while the job market gets shipped overseas. And we look at this bailout package and we just see that like Nancy Pelosi wants a SALT cap, Mitch McConnell has nothing he particularly wants to propose. And you're like, what are we going to do?
Yeah, and the Trump administration is like, how about a capital gains tax
Steve
cut?
Mnuchin and others are like, please cut the capital gains. And there are these like small dissenting voices that actually represent some of the people on the left, on the right, even in some of the administration, people like Peter Navarro. But put them up against the 15, 20, 30, 50, 100 others within that coalition or that organization that believe the opposite. And you just see, again, what you're up against. And I was reading this, and I'm just thinking about so many other people who are of that generation who feel truly hopeless. And nihilism is a dangerous thing for society. Because that's the moment, the longer and slower you have a slide towards the undermining of faith in your institutions, then you're going to, like we said here, Bernie and Trump are going to look like flashes in the pan of like sweet times in America. And you are going to look back. I've never been more convinced as I was 3 weeks ago when I was talking about how one of the largest populist uprisings in history will come than it is going to be right now. Because I'm looking at these millennials of blue collar and white collar workers who are having nothing, have mountains of student debt, inability to own anything, have to move to these cities and basically work in slave wages, two different jobs just to be able to make rent. And I'm like, you know what? They're not going to accept this, and they're not going to accept it for much longer, and they shouldn't have to. That's the most important thing. They should not have to. And it's not just left, on the right too. I think a lot of the people who are on the right and are young, they watch shows like this. They support people like Josh Hawley, who is the youngest U.S. senator. I think there's a reason for that, which is that over and over again, they've rejected the ideology that has been pushed down their throats to reflect the life circumstances that they accurately live in, to update to their cultural values, whether they're on the left or the right. And I think that's where the new politics really will be.
Well, and then there's all this shaming of young people for not showing up to vote.
Yeah,
and I think a big part of the reason why is this dynamic. And I would caution against that, as you said, cynicism and nihilism. Very, very dangerous. We can't afford to disengage with electoral politics, but I can't blame people either.
No, exactly. Why? I mean, I don't understand. I don't blame them for not having faith in the system because 30 years, in some cases, what's the high end of a millennial? Like 39 at this point? At that point, you've had for 39 years of failure. I mean, your entire lived reality for your adult life has been economic failure and basically like economic stagnation. So why should you have faith in the system? You have almost your entire adult life.
Yeah.
All right.
But you should still vote.
You should. All right, I'm looking forward to your radar next, Crystal.